keep these photographs with her throughout the war and still has them. Upon returning to Slakov, she was separated from her parents and younger sister, Rose, and her older sister, Esther. She never saw her parents, her older brother, or younger sister again, and never learned what their fate was. Adele was transported to a concentration camp in Oldenburg, Germany, where she worked in a factory making wooden soles for shoes. In 1943, she was transferred to Ludwigsdorf, where she worked in an ammunitions factory filling shells with gunpowder. From there, she went on to a camp at Austerlitz, where she was liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Adele returned to Slavkov soon after the war. She soon reunited with her older sister, Esther, who had also survived the camps. In September of 1945, the two of them moved to Wrocław, Poland, in formerly German Silesia. Shortly after arriving, she met Joseph Zygielbaum, a well-known hero of the Polish underground, whom she married in December of 1945. The newlyweds moved to a DP camp in Stuttgart, Germany, from which they emigrated to the United States in late 1946. They lived in New York, where Joseph worked for the Forward, which was the newspaper of the Jewish Socialist Workers Union. Their first son, Arthur, was born in 1947. Later that year, the family moved to Los Angeles. Their second son, Paul, was born in 1950. Adele and Joseph became American citizens in 1952. And Joseph went on to become a well-known technical translator and analyst of Soviet military and space programs. Adele and Joseph continued to live in the LA area until Joseph's death in 1995. Adele moved to Santa Rosa in 1999. Adele's advice to young people was, quote, never forget what happened, to tell the story so that it will never happen again, to remember the people that we've lost, to honor those who were not even privileged to have their own graves, and to understand that we are not responsible for our births, but we are responsible for our conduct. Adele died in 2009. Her sons, Arthur and Paul, established a memorial endowment in her honor to support the work of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. And I don't know if any members of Adele's family are joining us today, but if you are, thank you for your generosity. And so now I am pleased to introduce to you tonight's keynote speaker, James Waller, who is an old friend of the lecture series. Jim is, put simply, the foremost scholar of genocide in the world today. He is the author of many important books, including the landmark Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Killing, which Jim, you should know, all the students in class have read your book for today's discussion after your talk. Jim has also written widely for lay audiences. You might find his work in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, or the Washington Post. When I introduced Jim a few months ago at our 40th anniversary celebrations in November, I joked that in the academic world, you can tell how important someone is by the number of titles they have after their name. Jim has a lot of titles. He is the inaugural Christopher J. Dodd Chair in Human Rights and the director of the Dodd Human Rights Impact Program at the University of Connecticut. Jim is also a visiting scholar at the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast, and the director of academic programs for the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. Jim, as always, we're pleased that you could join us. Sad that it has to be remote, but I'm thrilled to turn the virtual podium over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bittner. Can you hear me okay on your end?
And so see if you can share screen.
Yeah, I believe I can. I've got permission, so I will do that in just a second. After I have a chance to say hello, I will share the screen and get started. So thank you for the kind introduction. It's great to see all of you. I can't see you, but I know you're there. I assume you're there. It's great to see so many old friends who are zooming in as well. I apologize very much that I couldn't be with you in person today. I had every plan to do so. As Steve said, I was at the 40th anniversary commemoration last November and got to catch up with a lot of people that I hadn't seen since COVID, and had every intention to be with you in person this week because this is always one of my favorite trips to make. But I'm teaching a large Introduction to Genocide Studies course here at University of Connecticut. And we've had a couple of weather-related events this semester that every time they've fallen, have fallen on the day of my class. So I'm terribly behind in that class with the cancellations. And in hindsight, this was probably a good idea for me to stay here because now we have both our men's and women's teams are in the Final Four. And last year, when our men's team won the national championship, I guess there was a lot of campus vandalism and they canceled classes the next day. So my class meets the day after the national championship. So I'm already kind of half thinking I'm going to lose another class to that type of silliness. So anyway, sorry I can't be with you this year. Certainly hope to be able to come back next year and see the beautiful new auditorium that you're meeting in. But thank you all for being here. Thank you for being in this class. This is an incredible Holocaust and Genocide lecture series and course that you have the opportunity to be in. I don't think there are any other college students in the US that have the opportunity you have through this course. So I will share my screen now. So as Dr. Bittner said, I'm the Christopher J. Dodd Chair in Human Rights Practice here at the University of Connecticut. My work in genocide studies over the years has focused primarily in two areas. One is genocide prevention, and the other is what we'll talk about tonight, which is perpetrator behavior. And it's great to hear that you've all read the book. I've also taught college long enough to know that sometimes when you assign a book, not everyone gets to it. So if you didn't get a chance to read it or finish it, our time together tonight should give you a general sense of what the book is about and what I've tried to argue. For 30 years now, I've been working in the field of perpetrator behavior as a social psychologist to try to understand how the presence of other people influences how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. So what I would like you to do for the hour and change that we have together tonight is I want to ask you to think with me as a psychologist, as a social psychologist, to look through the lens of psychology at the Holocaust and other cases of genocide, and to ask some of the questions psychologists would ask. Not questions of history necessarily, like who, what, when, and where, but questions of psychology, how, and most importantly, why. And to start with that, I'll show this brief video clip from an Einsatzgruppen activity in Liepāja, Latvia in 1941. You have probably at this point in the semester talked about the Holocaust. You've talked about the Einsatzgruppen, the four groups, operational battalions that followed the Wehrmacht eastward as the German army conquered territory. The Einsatzgruppen would come into a village and cleanse the village, liquidate the village of communist political opponents, and particularly Jews. These executions, which take place before the gas chambers become operative in the death camps in the East, these executions done by the Einsatzgruppen take the lives of at least 1.25 million victims. So these are not isolated massacres. This is large-scale, systematic mass killing over nearly a 2-year period. We have many photographs from these killings, some of them taken by disobedient soldiers, although in truth, I think now many of us in the field are thinking there are too many photographs that were taken and too close to the action for these to really be disobedient soldiers, chances are these were soldiers who were actually given permission, are told to take the photographs. We only have the one video piece of evidence from the Einsatzgruppen killings, and I'm going to show that video now, and if you like to look away, you certainly may. It's about 1:30 seconds. There is no sound to it. It's a black and white, grainy clip, but I want you to watch for all the actors in this video. The victims, the witnesses, the bystanders, and the perpetrators. And again, put on that lens, that hat, where you're thinking like a psychologist. So here's a video from Liepāja, Latvia. You see a pit has been dug the night before. This is the pit where the victims will be executed, then covered over, buried in a mass grave in this pit. You see in the foreground a pickup truck where victims have been brought from a nearby village. You see the victims here, many of them tagged on their clothing, getting out of the pickup truck. Notice the killing site is not in the middle of nowhere. You see buildings, you see a factory around this particular killing site in Liepāja. There you see the victim standing in the pit and the kill shot taken from above. Here you see the victims standing in line, looking, craning their necks to see what's happening in the pit. They know that this is what faces them. These are the last moments of their lives, and they're seeing it unfold in front of them. You see the kill shots again taken from on top. Again, not an isolated incident. 1.25 million to 1.5 million people, mostly Jews, killed in this way by the 4 operational units of the Einsatzgruppen. You see the bodies being covered over with some dirt and lime. Village after village liquidated in this way. So when we see a clip like this, as a psychologist, what we're asking are questions of individual agency. How do individuals use their agency? How do they act in this most extreme of human situations? And you look at a clip like this and you can ask questions about the victims. Most notably, what many people ask is, why didn't they run? They didn't have a place to run to. I mean, they were just picked up and were transported supposedly to a place for their own safety and protection. And they get there, and moments later, their lives are over. Their lives are taken. They file out of a truck. They see what's happening. There's a paralysis there. And even if they could run, where would they run to? How far would they get when they don't have the power that the perpetrator has over them in terms of armed strength? We see the bystanders. Who are the people who are standing by on these hillsides, watching these executions happen? How do they justify their inaction in the face of such evil? We don't see it in this clip, but we also see in cases of genocide, not enough, resistors and rescuers. If we had a ton of resistors and rescuers, we wouldn't have classes like the one you're in. There wouldn't be a need for them. But for those few people who resist, those few people who rescue, often at the risk of their own lives, what motivates them to use that particular agency? So we could have a whole lecture series structured around these different forms of individual agency. But what we'll talk about tonight is the final group, the perpetrators, the killers. And here I'm specifically looking, when we think of perpetrators, you could think of architects, the men, and it's by and large men at the top who are making the decisions about genocide. You could think about mid-level bureaucrats. My interest over the years hasn't been in either of those two groups, because by and large, most architects, most bureaucrats never literally bloody their hands with the hard work of killing. They make the decisions, they make the policies, they implement the policies, they're fully responsible for that. But if they don't find the men and women who carry out the policies, who do the killing at the front lines, we don't have genocide. Genocide happens because large numbers of humans kill other humans in large amounts over a significant period of time. So I'm looking at the rank and file. Without the rank and file, we don't have genocide. And it's only been relatively recently in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies, the past 20, 25 years, that we've really turned our attention to the rank and file perpetrators. So that's the attention that I'll bring us to tonight. Over the course of my career in working with rank and file perpetrators, I started in 1990 with archival work. I was teaching in Berlin, Germany. The wall had come down. New archives were opened in Eastern Europe. So I began the hard work of working through thousands of pages of archives to look at testimonies from trials, police interrogations, and so on related to perpetrator behavior in the Holocaust. But as a psychologist, a lot of times I would follow the length, I would follow the trail in that discussion and the interrogation, and it would go fine for a while, but then the interrogation would turn right, where as a psychologist, I wanted to turn left. So I knew early on, for me to do the work I wanted to do in this field, I would need to collect my own interviews so I could ask the questions I want to ask. And over the past 25 years, I've interviewed now over 225 perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, crime of genocide, some alleged, some convicted, some in prison, some out of prison, some never going to be put in prison, never going to be brought to justice. I've done these interviews throughout Latin America, throughout the Great Lakes region of Africa, former Yugoslavia, Northern Ireland, a few interviews in Southeast Asia. And whenever I do these interviews, which take place in prisons and homes and bars and any wide number of places, I'm always, when I'm on the ground, also take the time to do field work, to do interviews with witnesses and survivors, to ask them the question, why do you think, how do you think the perpetrators came to do what they did? Because in many cases, these people were your neighbors. They were certainly your countrymen and countrywomen. How did they come to do the things they did? So I'll start with a graphic illustration from one of those interviews, a survivor of a massacre at a church in Rwanda in Introduction. If you've studied Rwanda, and you probably have at this point, I know you have a couple of Rwandan lectures coming up in the series, 800,000 people killed over the course of 100 days. Many of those large massacres took place in churches and mission compounds because Tutsis fled to these places. When the killing started on April 7th, 1994, many Tutsi fled to these places thinking they would be, like they had been in the past, places of sanctuary. Unfortunately, in 1994, Hutu extremists had a different version of a final solution in mind. And instead of these churches and mission compounds being places of sanctuary, they became places where victims had rounded themselves up. Intoleramo is one of those churches where you'll see the scale of the church in a few moments. It's very small. About 5,000 Tutsi and some moderate Hutu were executed by Hutu extremists. I was introduced via my translator to a survivor of this massacre, a woman who had survived it. She agreed to tell me her story. She wanted to, for the first time, tell the story at the site of what she survived. So we went back to Intoleramo together. These are the church grounds. You see, there's not much here. I mean, this is not a big space. 5,000 people crammed in here, believing it was a safe place. Today, it's a place of memory for Rwanda, and it's a place that's been preserved as a site of memory. The survivor and I walked to the front door of the church, which you see here under the flag. She could not enter the church. I think it was hard enough for her to be at this site. She did not want to go into the church. I had been to this church several times previously in my research. The first time I came, The bodies lay where they had fallen. The bones were on the ground in the church. You didn't have to look hard to see defensive machete wounds on forearm bones. You can see bullet skulls that have been cleaved in two by a machete, skulls with bullet holes. But over time, Rwanda has changed the presentation of many of these places. But again, when I first visited, this is very much what it would have looked like. Her story was that she was one of the people in this church. In the top right-hand corner of this image, you see a church window that's been blown out by a hand grenade. She said she was by that window. She had been cut, meaning she had been hit with a machete. She took off a scarf and she showed me a scar that ran from the front of her neck all the way around to the rear, the back of her neck. Somehow she was able to survive this grievous wound, but she had been cut. She likely had been sexually violated, although she did not share that with me. She lost consciousness. The killers left her for dead. There were a lot of people to kill. They turned their attention elsewhere. But she said she regained consciousness from the wound, and as the killing continued, she was able to crawl out of this window that had been exploded open. And on her hands and knees, she found her way to the back of another building on the church grounds, which is here. This is a small Sunday school classroom where children went for religious education. This was a Catholic church. We went to the back of this building, and again, she did not want to go inside it. And she said from the back of this building, she lost consciousness here. And for the next several hours, she lapsed out of consciousness, back into consciousness, out of consciousness, back into it. But she said every time she was conscious, she heard a sound from inside this church, inside this building, and she just described it as a wet slap. And she said a few moments would pass and she'd hear the sound again. She didn't know what it was, she said. She knew it wasn't gunshot because she had heard gunshot. She knew it wasn't machete because she had felt the blow of a machete. She had heard the sound a machete makes. Eventually, the killers left. She regained enough strength to look inside the building. And if you and I were there today, this is what we would see in this small Sunday school classroom. What she saw were about 150 children scattered across these concrete pews. All the children have been killed. How had they been killed? As you see from the blood stain in the upper left-hand corner of this room, they had been killed by being swung headfirst against the wall. And that was the sound she had been hearing. Now, I apologize for the graphic nature of it, of this example. It is unfortunately not unprecedented. It's not terribly creative. We've seen American cavalry troops kill Native American children in the 1800s in this way by throwing them headfirst against the side of a fort. We have seen Armenian children killed by Turkish paramilitaries during the Armenian genocide in this way. We've seen Jewish children killed in the Holocaust this way. In Cambodia, if you visit and ask to see sites of memories, you will be taken to killing trees, where children and small adults were swung headfirst against trees. So for all its brutality, it unfortunately was not the first time we've seen it in history, and likely won't be the last time. Why is it done? I think you can get into a lot of psychological thinking about, destruction of the face and all of these things. But in truth, for the perpetrators, it's efficient. They don't waste ammunition in Rwanda. They don't dull the machete. All of those things they can protect simply by taking the energy to pick someone up by the feet and swing them against a wall. Now, I want to step back from the victims in this room and think about the perpetrators, the people who did the killing. Who are those people? How would you describe them? If someone's not in your class and you describe this atrocity to them, what would they say about the killers? Most of them would say madmen, lunatics, sadistic beasts, monsters. But I start with this graphic example because it was 4 years later. I happened to be back in Rwanda. I was interviewing a perpetrator in Central Prison 23 in Kigali. I didn't get his charge sheet before the interview started, so we started the interview cold. So I didn't know where he was from, what he had done, and so on. He had already been convicted, but I didn't have the specific info. And he said something early in the interview that triggered a memory for me. And then as the interview went on, I realized what that memory was. I just by coincidence happened to be interviewing someone who was a perpetrator of this particular crime. Not only did he do some of the killing in this room, he led the killing in this room. Now, again, if he was a sadistic, brutal, psychopathic madman, we could stop here and we could all be done early, and we just say, well, we just got to watch out for those people and protect ourselves from them. But he was very different, but in my experience, very typical of perpetrators I've interviewed, in that he was from this village. This was his hometown. This was his church. He had been an altar boy in this church. He had taken mass in this church 2 weeks before he did this killing. He was the equivalent of a grade school teacher in this village in Entorama. When we asked him, were any of the children you killed your students, current or former, he said yes. He was a well-known footballer in the region. He coached football. Were any of the children your athletes, current or former? Yes. When we talked to people in the village after this interview, even Tootsie in the village said, he was a great guy. I mean, we trusted our children with him. He was part of our community. He was part of the fabric of who this village is. We just can't believe he could do something like this. When we asked him, how did you come to do this stuff? How did you come to commit these atrocities? He just kept repeating in Rwanda over and over again, I lost myself. I did not know who I was. I lost myself. I did not know who I was. So what we're trying to do tonight, and what I've tried to do in the book, is say, how do we understand the process? And process is a key word. The process by which perpetrators come to do this. Because I do not believe, and I've never interviewed a perpetrator who on Monday was given permission to kill and said, this is great, I can't wait, it's what I've always wanted to do, this is my life ambition, I'm ready to kill. They've all gone through a process by which they became capable of doing something they never thought they would do. And they don't even understand the process, so we're trying to unpack it from the outside. In terms of numbers of rank and file perpetrators, we don't know the answer here about how many. I get this question often. How many people are we talking about in terms of killers? We don't have a precise number. Killers aren't lining up to write their memoirs. They're not queuing up to have movies made about them. They're trying to hide what they've done. They're not trying to expose what they've done. So all we can do are come up with estimates. I've given you here some ranges. I think the reality is always at the upper end of all these ranges, at least 500,000, if not more. Germans, Lithuanians, Latvians, Poles, Austrians, and others who bloodied their hands with the hard work of killing in the Holocaust. I think easily over 250,000 perpetrators in Rwanda. The government of Rwanda today says 1 million. I think that's probably a stretch, but I think easily over 250,000. Bosnia-Herzegovina, judges there tell me that there are at least 25,000 Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks, but particularly Serbs, who should be brought to justice for war crimes, crimes of humanity, and the crime of genocide, but who probably never are going to be brought to justice. In the case of the Serbs, many of those are back doing what they did during the conflict, which is they're in the police, they're in the military, they're in the security sector. So even though we don't have exact numbers, for genocide to be successful from the viewpoint of the perpetrator regime, you're going to have thousands and thousands of people willing to carry out the killing. And unfortunately, we've never had a genocide where regimes had to throw up its hands and say, as much as we'd love to kill this group of people, we can't find the killers. They can always find the killers. There's never a shortage of killers. So to give you a sense here of, we also don't have exact numbers because most of these perpetrators escape prosecution. Here's one estimate from University College London that there are about 200,000 perpetrators of Nazi-era crimes, 140,000 cases brought between 45 and 2005, many of those in East Germany, the former East Germany, but even there, only a bit over 6,600 were ever convicted. So by and large, perpetrators, the rank and file, will get away with what they did. Who we go after in terms of international justice are the architects, the real big fish. That's who we want to grab. And even the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, for instance, only indicted 91 people. The International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia only indicted 161 people. Both genocides involved far more perpetrators than that, but those are the only ones brought to justice internationally. Now, domestically, we tried to do a bit better in both cases, but even there, most often perpetrators are able to get away with what they've done. So if you were to ask me what I've worked on for 30 years, it's this simple, not simple, it's a complex question, but it's pretty straightforward. Who are the people who perpetrate atrocities and how do they come to do it? What's the process by which they come to do it? Christopher Browning is a friend who was my entree into this field in the early 1990s. And at one point, Chris wrote, and he was a historian, is a historian, can one recapture the experiential history of these killers, the choices they faced, the emotions they felt, the coping mechanisms they employed, the changes they underwent? And what Chris was saying was, as a historian, he felt he couldn't do that. That was beyond the realm of history. That was beyond who, what, when, and where. That went to questions that, as a historian, were harder for him to grapple with. But for me as a psychologist, I looked at these questions from Chris and I thought, yeah, that's exactly what I'm trained to do. That's exactly what the field of psychology does. We try to step into the shoes of people, people who commit these type of atrocities, and we try to understand what choices do they think they had. It doesn't matter what choices we think they had. That's irrelevant to their behavior. What's relevant to their behavior is what choices do they think they had? What emotions did they feel? What do you feel emotionally when you kill in the way perpetrators kill? Innocent, even though in their minds they may not be innocent, but unarmed people. What emotions do you feel when you take a life? How do you cope with it? Is it drinking? Is it drugs? Is it denial? Is it separation? I mean, how do you cope with what you've done? And what changes do you undergo? What's the process that you undergo to be able to commit these type of crimes? So this has been what I've spent my career doing, for better or worse. It's what I do, trying to answer these questions. And I think when you approach these questions, what you always have to be careful about is asking yourself the why question. Why do I want to study this? I don't want to study it because I want to forgive perpetrators. I don't want to study it because I want to apologize for perpetrators. I want to study it. Why I want to study it is I want to prevent it. In other words, I'm studying this like reverse engineering. Here's a problem. Let's unpack the problem and see how we got to the problem. And if we can see how we got to the problem, maybe we can figure out how we don't get to the problem again. And that's the heart of what I've been trying to do, is to understand the psychology of perpetrator behavior, not just for its own understanding, but to understand it from the standpoint of prevention. As we go through, I hope you're taking note of questions, and I'll make sure to leave some time at the end for us to have that Q&A time together. Other people have looked at this same question before me, but I think before I started working on this, most people really emphasized the extraordinary origins of this type of evil. In other words, they said, here's a horrible evil, like the example we started with Introduction. There can't be anything ordinary about where that comes from. That has to be extraordinary. So people looked at, maybe it's the group. When whenever a group or a collective, bad things happen. That's a really simplistic understanding of groups and collectives. Sometimes groups come together, bad things happen. Sometimes groups come together, incredibly good things happen. Groups amplify the tendencies of people. They don't just make people do horrible things. So I don't think that's a great answer. Some people say worldview that is anti-Semitic, then you're naturally prone to becoming a killer. I think ideology is part of understanding the question, but it's not the only part. I mean, again, it's way too simplistic to think you can just reduce it to ideology. I think by far the two most common explanations people have given from this extraordinary standpoint, I've called the mad Nazi and bad Nazi thesis. The mad Nazi thesis says the people who commit these type of atrocities have to be pathological. They have some type of emotional, mental, behavioral disturbance that leads them to commit these atrocities. And if we just can identify who's pathological, we just put them away and we keep them away from us and we'll be safe. We had a chance to test the mad Nazi thesis at the Nuremberg trials in 45, 46. The chair I hold, the Christopher J. Dodd chair, his father, Thomas J. Dodd, was also a Connecticut State Senator. And Thomas Dodd was one of the lead prosecutors at Nuremberg. So one of the highlights of holding my position here at University of Connecticut is I'm also, we hold the archives of the Thomas J. Dodd papers, which are all of his letters home and all of his notes and all of his prosecution papers from Nuremberg. There were 21 Nazi leaders on trial at Nuremberg. These weren't rank and file. These were, we'll talk more about that in a moment. But we also had a psychiatrist, Douglas Kelly, and a psychologist, Gustav Gilbert, at Nuremberg, who were able to give both IQ testing and Rorschach testing to the Nuremberg defendants. And the IQ test, the average score, and this is normed across culture and history, the way the IQ test works, the average score is 100. If you go to college and get a degree, the average IQ is around 110. If you go on and get a PhD, the average IQ is 120. I'm a PhD. I work with PhDs. And I always say we're like 80, 85 on our best days. But supposedly, we'd have a higher IQ, genius level, 130, 140, 150. So the question for the Nazis on trial that Kelly and Gilbert were asking was, what is their intelligence level? Now, what the world wanted to see was we wanted them to be stupid. We wanted them to be low intelligence because if it's stupid people who do evil things, we can fix stupid. We can educate people into goodness, into thinking more rationally and more humanely about the world in which they live. But what we saw is really what we should have expected to see. Not only were these men intelligent, but they were highly intelligent. Some of them tested very close, if not at the genius level. Now, again, if you look for people's natural explanations for this type of evil, what they want is something that puts evil at a distance. So if evil is done by people with low IQ, that's good for me because I'm not low IQ. That can keep them out there. And again, we could identify them. But at Nuremberg, the men in the dock were highly intelligent men. So then we turn to the Rorschach test, which some of you recognize from the Watchmen movie or comic book series, graphic novels. The Rorschach test is a series of 14 ink blots that we show someone and we simply ask them, what do you see in this? I'm not trained in Rorschach analysis. It's a long process to become trained in Rorschach analysis, but in the hands of someone who's trained in it, what you see in these very ambiguous images is you're projecting your personality into your answers. Now, it's never obvious. It's not like someone looks at this and says, I see a knife, I see my mother, I see blood. I mean, it's not anything overt like that, but in the hands of someone who's trained in it, they can use your answers to see if there are levels of pathology in your responses. Now, again, what do we hope to see among the defendants at Nuremberg? We hope to see pathology. Because again, if they're pathological, it makes them different from us, and it allows us to keep them at a distance. We can identify them. We can put them away somewhere. But what do we see? Everyone at Nuremberg, with one exception, tested well within the bounds of normality. They were psychologically healthy individuals. One psychologist looked at the results and he said, they're psychologically well adjusted, much more adjusted than I feel after I see the results, because the results are so disturbing. The only Nazi at Nuremberg who tested as pathological was Julius Streicher. And you probably have learned about Julius Streicher. Many of the anti-Semitic images you see in Nazi propaganda come from Streicher's mind. But even his co-defendants knew Streicher was crazy. I mean, his co-defendants said to legal counsel, we know we're going to be tried, but we don't want to be tried with Streicher because he makes us look bad. When someone says of you, if you're a Nazi, and then someone says of another person, that Nazi says he makes us look bad, you're pretty bad. I mean, you're pretty far off. So even his co-defendants knew that. So if it's not low intelligence, if it's not pathology, there was then this decades-long search for some type of twisted personality, what I've called the bad Nazi thesis, some type of personality that was fanatical or authoritarian that could help us predict who was capable of these atrocities. And to make a very long and complicated story short, we just never found it. No, I mean, there probably are a few people still looking for the so-called Nazi personality. It's just not there. We don't have a personality cluster or set of traits or profile that enable us to predict ahead of time, or even, understand after the fact who is capable of committing these atrocities. So what it leaves us with, and if you're still awake, this is the key point to the whole thing. My central argument, it's ordinary people like you and me who commit genocide and mass killing. I felt this doing the archival work. This was my sense. It's only been reaffirmed over 225 times with all the perpetrators I've interviewed face to face. I'm not apologizing for them. I'm just describing who they are as people. They were killers. They killed. But there was an ordinariness to who they were before the killing. They loved others. They were loved by someone else. They celebrated birthdays. They had hopes, dreams, aspirations. I mean, I just haven't interviewed the walking manifestation of a nightmare that people think about when they think about perpetrators. Perpetrators I've interviewed are very ordinary people like you and me who make choices, who use their agency in ways that make small choices that lead them to the precipice of killing, and then they make the biggest choice, which is choosing to kill. And understanding how they get to that precipice and then how they make the decision to do the killing is part of what I tried to outline. Again, this argument is a difficult one for all of us because it's difficult because if you look at other people around the room and you say, okay, if this is true, there are people in this room, there are people in this college, there are people in this community who could commit crimes like this. And yeah, there are, because they've happened all over the world. But the deeper truth and the more unsettling truth is less about what it says about everyone else and more about what it says about me. What am I capable of? Could I do something like this? Could I make the choices in certain situations to dehumanize people, to demonize people, to discriminate against people, to scapegoat people, to blame people, to fear people? Could I make that series of escalating choices that lead me to the point where I say, well, now that I'm at this point, killing someone does seem like the logical thing to do, because that's the point that perpetrators have gotten to. Tina Rosenberg has written about violent criminals in Latin America. One chapter on genocide or genociders, but mostly other violent criminals. And she said, I wanted them to be monsters. Coming to understand this is not the case was disturbing. What it taught me about these people and ultimately about myself. And she goes on to say, I did not want to think that many of the violent are people like us, so civilized, so educated, so cultured, and because of that, so terrifying. People like us. So how do people like us come to do this? I'm working on a third edition of Becoming Evil, which I've been saying for a few years, but I keep writing other books that keep pushing it to the side. But Oxford has finally said, I have to do this. So working on this third edition, and I'm reconceptualizing how we understand perpetrator psychology by thinking of a staircase model where perpetrators make decisions that escalate and eventually lead to the point of perpetration. So let's look at the 5 steps of this in the next 10 minutes or so, and then we'll get to questions. The first step I think that's important is perpetrators come to see the other as an existential threat. In other words, the other, whether the other is Jewish, Tutsi, Muslim, Christian, whatever the other is, however the other is defined, perpetrators come to see them as not just an annoyance, not just a hindrance, but an existential threat, a threat to their own existence. Think back to much of the Nazi propaganda. How did it depict Jews? As a threat to the existence of the Aryan race. When the other is seen as an existential threat, a threat to my economic existence, a threat to my religious existence, a threat to my national existence, a threat to my physical existence, that's a huge first step, because now the question becomes, what do we do with the threat? Do we run away from it? Do we push it away somewhere? Do we exterminate it? These are the questions we have to deal with when the other has become a threat inside of us, inside of our community. So the second step I look at in the staircase model is what I've called moral reorientation. And what I'm saying here is that once you've depicted in your mind the other as an existential threat, now you have to get over the moral problem of, what do I do with this threat? In other words, it's not just disengaging yourself morally, but it's reorienting your moral universe so that you're still a good moral person, but the other doesn't matter for your own morality. In other words, I've never interviewed a perpetrator who said to me, I know I'm a horrible person. I know I'm immoral. I'm just a bad person. They've all said the same thing. I'm a good person. You have to understand I'm a good person. I thought I was doing the right thing. How can you say to me you're a good person when you've hacked 52 people to death? You can say it because you've taken your moral orientation and you've said, my moral commitment is to these people who are like me. To these other people who aren't like me in some way, I can do whatever I want to them. And that doesn't change the fact that I'm a moral person. This is what I mean by moral reorientation. We dehumanize the other. We demonize the other in such a way that their destruction isn't a bad thing. In fact, their destruction's a good thing. Their destruction is a necessary thing. So I think that moral reorientation piece is an important one. Mary Wollstonecraft has written, no man chooses evil because it is evil. He only mistakes it for happiness, the good he seeks. And again, this has been my experience with perpetrators. They're not doing evil because it's evil. They're doing evil because they think they're doing good. And if there's nothing else you take from tonight, take that reality. The perpetrators of atrocity are doing evil because they think they are doing a good. It's how they live with themselves. It's how they justify why they're doing what they're doing. I think the third step I look at in this staircase model is blaming the victims. This is really part also of the more reorientation piece, but I'm looking here, and the last question I ask myself, when I go in to do these interviews, it's stressful. I'm worried about it going in. I have my questions I want to cover in a semi-structured interview, but my last kind of calm moment when I breathe before it starts, I just remind myself, I want to understand the lies they tell themselves to help them sleep at night. In other words, I want to know how perpetrators live with themselves, given what they've done. What lies do they tell themselves to help themselves sleep at night? One lie is the other was a threat. Second lie is they weren't part of my moral universe. A third big lie is the victims were responsible for their own victimization. This concept of blaming the victims, we unfortunately are all too familiar with. Victims of rape and sexual assault will say that one of the most difficult parts of the recovery process, and it's a long journey, is that moment when someone close to them starts to ask questions that blame them for their own victimization. What were you wearing? What did you say? How much did you have to drink? Why you were there that time of night? I mean, we ask these questions because we hate to live in a world where victims can be victimized in this way, and we're trying to restore some sense of a fair and just world. But to victims, it's another form of re-victimization. Perpetrators do the same. They blame the victims for what happened to them because it takes the blame away from them. I'll give you two quick examples here, both of them ridiculous examples, but unfortunately true. I've interviewed one Holocaust perpetrator in 1990 when I was teaching in Germany. He had been sentenced for his crimes, served time and released. And it was a 45-minute interview. And for 44 minutes, he said all the right things. It's horrible what he did to the Jews, stain our national conscience, should never have done it, on and on and on. But then the final minute, just as I was closing up the tape recorder, he was an older man, and he sat up in his chair and he put his finger in my face, uncomfortably close for me, but put his finger in my face, and he said, "But you have to remember, the Jews were going to take over the world." And then he sat back. And in that minute, he told me everything I needed to know. How he slept at night is the lie he told himself was the Jews were going to take over the world. And even though he did horrible things, he at least stopped the Jews from taking over the world. In a similar case, I was interviewing 6 Serbian policemen who had, I think 5 of the 6 had participated in atrocities at Srebrenica, and the other one had participated in atrocities elsewhere. They had never been charged, will never be charged. They're still policemen in Serbia. And we interviewed them one by one. And one of the questions we asked them is why the target group? In this case, why the Bosniaks? Why the Bosnian Muslims? And the first one we interviewed without hesitation said, because the Muslims killed Christ. I noted it. We kind of let it go. We went to the second interview, same thing. Why the Muslims? Because they killed Christ. And by the third interview, we're starting to be more aggressive, the translator and I, with the questions and saying, who told you the Muslims killed Christ? Well, our priest, who in this case blessed them the night before the killing and then joined them in the killing, said our priest told us the Muslims killed Christ and that we were doing God's work by killing the Muslims. And we pointed out with some effort that the Muslim faith didn't exist for like over 600 years after Christ. I mean, they couldn't have, the faith wasn't around at the time of Christ. It wasn't like a Monday, Tuesday thing. It's almost 7 centuries before Islamic faith comes into being. And even when we're able to convince them that that's the case, that there's no way the Muslims killed Christ, just completely ahistorical, one of them says, Well, maybe you're right. And I think we convinced that one by showing him Wikipedia of all things. We said, here's when the Islamic faith started, so it couldn't have happened. And he said, well, maybe you're right. But if the Muslims had been alive at the time of Christ, they would have killed him. And then that was their justification. So when we blame the victims, we're going to do that regardless of how rational or irrational it is. I also think there is a professional socialization involved in perpetrator behavior. And what I mean here is whether it's military or paramilitary or neighbors killing neighbors, you're socialized into how to do the killing. Sometimes it's very formal. So in a military setting, you may be formally taught how to kill and how to kill without remorse. In a paramilitary setting, it's going to be more semi-formal, even though when it's neighbors killing neighbors, you're learning by watching people around you. You're being socialized into how to do it correctly, how to do it creatively, how to do it with brutality, and how to do it as part of a group, how to do it with some sense of camaraderie. Genocide doesn't happen because one person goes on a killing spree. It happens because a lot of people choose to kill large numbers of other people over an extended period of time. So I'm interested in those group dynamics and professional socialization. And then finally, just in how people identify with a group. And when you identify with a group, one of the things that happens is you repress your own individual conscience. You give your individual conscience over to the group. And I think that's an important piece of understanding, again, how perpetrators distance themselves from what they do. And taken together, you see the other as a threat, you reorient your morality so the other is outside of your moral universe. You blame them for their own victimization. You learn through socialization how the killing works, how to do the killing, and you identify with a group and you choose to give your conscience over to the group. I think when we look at this escalating staircase, we get a pretty clear sense of how perpetrators come to that point where for them, it seems to be that the next logical thing to do is to kill, because every choice they've made up until then has led to that point. I want to close before we get to questions by saying that while I study evil, I do recognize, as Svend and Todorov said, that once introduced into public life, evil does easily perpetuate itself. And we see this in genocide. Once a killing starts, it perpetuates itself. More and more people kill until they're stopped. In those settings, good is difficult. It's rare and it's fragile. What Todorov reminds us, and yet possible. It's still possible to do good. What I resist in all the interviews I do with perpetrators, and a lot of them get to this point where they say, you have to understand, I had no choice. I had no agency. They all had choice. They all had agency. Maybe it was more limited than my choices and agency, but they still had choice, and it was, and yet possible for them to do something different than kill. But they still made the choice to kill. And in understanding how they were led to that choice and the choices they made to get to that point of killing, I think it gives us some opportunities to also think about prevention. As you know, this is the book that you read, quote unquote, read for class tonight. This book goes into much more detail about much of what we've discussed tonight, but I think we have a little bit less than 15 minutes left for questions and discussion, which I always enjoy with this group. So I will stop screen sharing and turn it back over to Dr. Bittner to moderate the Q&A.
So this works pretty well in this classroom. So if you have a question for Professor Waller, please raise your hand. I'll call on you, and then all you have to do is stand up and speak loudly, and Jim can hear you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. We really appreciate it. My name is Ana Lugo, and I'm wondering, I can't help but think about what's happening in the United States as you're giving us this presentation. And obviously, I would like to believe we're many steps away from the level of violence that you are talking about. But as we look at the staircase model, and you talk about othering, and I think about the different political realities that we've gone through in the past 4 years, past 8 years, I wonder what your perspective is on what's happening in the United States in relation to the level of violence that you study.
Thank you. Great question, Dr. Bittner. She deserves an A. She can just stop the course now. You can give her the grade. It's a great question. I'm so glad you connected to the local context. In 2020, before the presidential election, I was asked to write a policy paper, a briefing paper on the risk of political violence in the U.S. So I looked at it from a standpoint of governance, economic conditions, memory, social fragmentation, and I argued in the paper, and it made it clear, I predicted that between election day and inauguration, there was a very high chance for political violence. I hated being right on that, but from everything I saw compared to other countries that had political violence, we had everything trending that direction. When we published that paper like 3 weeks before the election, so this wasn't hindsight. This was before the election and 2 months before the violence. But I still remember one of the places that the publisher took the piece to was the New York Times, and they said, would you be interested in an editorial making this argument that political violence is possible here in the US? And the New York Times, a liberal, fairly liberal newspaper, wrote back and said, no, this is too alarmist. This doesn't happen here. That ignored the fact that we have a country that, we have a rich history of political violence. It has happened here. It does happen here. So now in retrospect, everyone looks at it and says, oh yeah, it was clear political violence was going to happen. Yeah, it was. And it was clear before it happened. We had the potential for it. And the truth is that once political violence has happened in a country, the chances of it happening again escalate tremendously. So we are not over it. It's not cathartic that we had it and now it's over. It can happen again. It can happen from the left. It can happen from the right. It happened from the right on January 6th. It could happen from the right again, but we can also see a situation where the political violence comes from the left. But the point is that, what we've talked about in the staircase model, the othering, the blaming the victims, especially this sense of existential threat. When I think back to January 6th, and I'll reference here a conversation I had with Harry Dunn. We had Harry Dunn here at UConn in the fall. Harry was one of the U.S. Capitol police officers. He actually just quit the police force and is running for political office in his home state of Maryland, I believe. And Harry and I had a long talk about January 6th because he was literally there. I mean, he was the one trying to protect Congress people. He was at the door. He was trying to hold the door. And the only thing that made sense for him was the threat piece. He said, all of these people attacking the Capitol, they really felt they were under threat. And I asked him, well, what were they under threat from? They felt their Christianity was under threat and attack. They felt that their national identity was under threat and attack, that what they thought of themselves as Americans was Christian nationalists. And when they felt that was under threat, this is what they saw as the most obvious response to that threat. So no, it's a great question because many of the things we talk about that happen over there or at another different point in history, those same dynamics of deep divisions and social fragmentation and battles over history and memory, those things are absolutely happening here for sure. So thank you.
Jim, do you want to tell us what step we're on?
No, I don't. I think there's absolutely seeing the other as existential threat. We've always had the other in U.S. society, and most societies do, but we depict the other as a threat to our existence in some very significant ways now politically that just didn't used to be expressed the way they're expressed today. I think there's absolutely a moral reorientation that we have about the other, and now typically for us that other is defined politically. I do think there is a process of blaming the victims for their own victimization. So I certainly see, we have the things in place that if left unchecked can lead to more and even broader widespread violence. But we also have what I'd call resilience factors. We have things in place that can check this violence. We're still a functioning democracy, even if we're a flawed democracy. We still have a rule of law, even if the rule of law doesn't protect everyone equally, we still have some semblance of rule of law. So we have things that protect us, but I think it'd be naive to suggest that we have no chance of seeing something like January 6th happen again a year from now. I think we could easily see something like that happen again.
So I will take a question here from the chat. And this comes from Todd, who's a member of the Alliance. Jürgen Habermas, that's I think our first Habermas reference of the semester, defers to social psychology regarding German feelings of seeking to liberate themselves from their past extremes, notably the singularity of the Shoah. As a social psychologist, please comment on the attempts by so many in Europe to, as Habermas writes, level out the extremes they had experienced during the existence of the Hitler regime.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I understand the entire thrust of the question. But I do think one of the things that struck me when I saw the question in the chat was how Germans are dealing with their past and what it means in Germany to deal with this past. So, I mean, Germany has, I think to my mind, done some exceptional things to deal with the horrors of the past that they inflicted on Jews, on Roma, Sinti, and other populations. And so, for instance, in Germany, denying the Holocaust is still a crime. That doesn't fit with our notion of free speech as much, but in German society, it's been, hey, for us to go forward, we can't ever, as a country, have people saying that this thing didn't happen. It did happen. We have to recognize it. And I was just reading today that Germany, another challenge it has, is it's now trying to deal with its relationship with Israel in a complicated situation now with the war between Israel and Hamas, because Germany has always felt its national obligation. I think I forget the German word, Staatsräson, state reason, that part of its justification to be the German state is it has to have unfailing support for Israel. And Germany has had that since the establishment of the state of Israel by and large. But today there are a lot of German citizens and politicians questioning, can we still support a state that seems to be engaging in disproportionate warfare? And so Germany is really having to question what that allegiance to Israel has meant. And so I think for all of its flaws, and every state has flaws, Germany still has stayed, in my mind, very self-reflective about its role in the Holocaust, its legacy for having perpetrated the Holocaust as a state, and what it means for its national identity today as well. So I hope that at least got to some part of the question.
Victoria, back to class. Stand up and introduce yourself and speak loud.
My name is Victoria Weidhauser. This is playing off of the first question. I was wondering if I could hear your opinion on, I've seen throughout a lot of the studies that I've done, a lot of the politicians who ended up leading this came in with promises of bringing order or a new rule of law or reorganization of it. But then in often cases, the perpetrators never cared about that certain thing when they were undertaking the actions, only pointing to it as a later justification for those actions. Where, as you mentioned, the Germans said that, well, they were going to take over the world. And I was wondering if this promise might be seen in a lot of modern political talk about refugees and how we need to assert law and order. Could you see this as one of the steps towards this politically charged violence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the assertion of we need law and order is responding to that first step in the staircase of the existential threat. You only need law and order when you're under threat from something. And politicians have, and I think we've seen this increasingly in the US, built political platforms less on what we can construct together as a community, as a unity, and more on how we respond to threat. So what is the threat? The threat is abortion. The threat are immigrants and refugees. The threat is diversity. It's multiculturalism. It's equity. It's inclusion. It's religious diversity. I mean, we build platforms against these threats to protect ourselves. And then the other side builds platforms against those threats that are going to be protective in that other direction. So I think anytime you see political discourse responding to threat, that is disconcerting. And it seems to be where much of our political discourse has gone today. And then once you're exactly right, that once a law and order party or president is in power, often they're very willing to violate law and order to do whatever they need to eliminate the threat. And one of the things we see, and we certainly saw this in the Holocaust, is the threat always expands. So the threat was never going to be just the Jews. It was also going to be the Sinti and the Roma. It was also going to be Slavic people, Polish. I mean, the threat was going to keep expanding simply to keep a group in power. So that's a good question. Thank you.
Yes, please stand up and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Paul, and I was wondering about how do you see the timing for going down the staircase model? Because personally, when I see like online where people are kind of funneled down, we call it the alt-right pipeline. It takes place within like a year, maybe a couple months. So I think it might be more like tripping down a staircase more than like.
Yeah. No, that's good. Oh, that's helpful. That's helping me think through the staircase model more as I go into it. I think you have to add to the staircase model. I mean, some of these things are things that happen very slowly over a period of time. So, for instance, with anti-Semitism, we had 2,000 years of anti-Jewish teaching and anti-Semitism that defined Jews as the other. So that's a very, very long stair that we were on. But what you have to add to the staircase model are the triggers. What are the things externally that move potential into reality? It's what fire personnel call a flashover point. At what point does a fire in a room become a room on fire? That's a flashover point. So I think the staircase model has its own flashover points. At what point does an existential threat become such a significant threat that the only viable source of response is extermination? There's a ton of different ways you can respond to threat. But what's that flashover point where the response option becomes extermination? It has to be extermination. So those are the trigger or flashover points that I think we have to lay on top of this staircase model to start to get an idea of why it really activates perpetrator behavior. I know we have a time limit. Stephen, do we have time for one more question?
Unfortunately, I'm the professor of the class, and so
Yeah.
ability to push us out by a few minutes if the discussion demands that. So yes, please stand up and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Jada McClure, and my question was, hopefully this is appropriate. Knowing what the Jewish people went through during the Holocaust, what would be the psychological or moral reasons of what the Israel government is doing to the people of Palestine?
Did you hear that, Jim?
I did. Now I'm wishing we had stopped with the questions before we got to that one, because that's a hard one.
This first speaker we've had who has touched the third rail voluntarily this semester.
Okay. I'm the first or not the first?
The first.
Oh, yeah. I just finished teaching the case study of the Holocaust in my intro course here. We have over 100 students in the course. We have many Jewish students. We have many Palestinian students, many Arab students in the course. And what I asked them to do, without getting into the visceral tensions over this, is to say, all I want to ask you to do is approach understanding Israel and Palestine through the lens of trauma that people have suffered. So can you understand Israel's response through the trauma of what it means to live through the Holocaust and the reality, not the paranoia, the reality that someone tried to wipe you off the face of the earth? You have to look at Israel's response through the lens of that trauma. And then you also have to look at Palestine's response historically through the lens of the Nakba of 1948, a forcible displacement, 700,000 people, and the trauma that Palestinians still live with because they were forcibly displaced. Can you look at the conflict through the lens of what that trauma feels like for Palestinians who still live with that every day? I think if both sides and if all of us could take turns looking at a country's response through the lens of the traumas they've experienced, it helps us understand a little bit more those responses. As Edward Said said, for Palestinians, to be victims of the victims is an unusual place to be in, because you would think that people who have been victimized to the degree that Jews were victimized would never themselves turn around and victimize other people. But you also have to understand that the security consciousness of Israel, which is huge, a huge military force, which the US supports, that security consciousness is born out of history. It's born out of trauma. It's born out of a sense that never again will we not have a country to go home to. Never again are we going to be subjected to extermination. And then you have a Palestinian side that's born out of a response of, we were forcibly displaced. And ever since the Nakba, we haven't had a present. We haven't had a future. We're kind of mired in the trauma of that past. So I'm not trying to avoid a response to your question. I hope I'm giving a constructive response to say, you can't understand anything about this conflict and people's responses to it, I don't think, without seeing it through the lens of the trauma that both peoples have been exposed to.